Hey guys, my name is Carl Clark, and I'm here to share with you some interesting features about Google Forms. Google Forms is generally designed as a survey or a quizzing tool, but there's some other clever things that you could do with Google Forms that I think could really benefit your students and your teaching practice that I'd like to share with you. So in order to use Google Forms, make sure that you are logged into your Google account. You can use this waffle here to access different applications in the Google Suites, or you could simply type www.drive.google.com. Once you arrive at your Google Drive, in order to access Google Forms or any Google application, you click on New. In this case, I need to select More, and I'm going to use Google Forms. What's great about Google Forms is you can start from scratch, which is honestly generally what I do, but there are also some amazing templates that you could use as well, and I hope you explore it, like exit tickets and evaluations, and there's a lot of great templates in there that you may find useful. Let's start with a blank form so I can show you some basic features. So right off the bat, you can alter how this thing looks. You could select an image to go along the top to give it some aesthetic appeal. There's lots of things that you could do with the way it appears. I generally don't mess with that until the very end, but some of the important features I really need to share with you are how to add questions. So in order to add a question, you just hit this plus button, and there are lots of different types of questions that you could ask in Google Forms. Obviously, multiple choice is super useful. Checkbox questions are very useful if you want kids to select more than one answer. There are times where you could even have kids upload files, which can be useful, and many other types of questions that are very useful as well. Typically, I use multiple choice, checkboxes, and I do use short answer a lot because you can set in the answer key the correct answer and it will automatically assess it for you. And I do use paragraphs quite often because I want kids to reflect on things, and I do use that generally. So those are the ones that I typically use. Some really important details that I think I need to share with you are you could add text, media, videos, and add different sections, which I'll show you later on. But I need to dive into these settings here because using these settings you can get pretty clever. So I generally always collect email addresses. If you work for a school organization, like it says here, it's going to require them to supply their email. It does it automatically, actually. But there are times where I need to unselect this because I do need to share a Google form with somebody who is outside of the organization. But I always have some sort of email address that I could verify who it was. So that's something you definitely need to have selected somehow, in my opinion. In the presentation features, I generally don't show the progress bar for students just because it's not very helpful. It does show them how far they progress in the form depending on how many sections you've included. Depending on how the Google form is organized, you can shuffle the questions. There are times where you don't want that because you want the questions to come in a very specific order. So for me, I typically don't shuffle the question order unless it's a traditional quiz. But I do allow kids to submit other responses because typically I use Google Forms as kind of formative assessments for students themselves as well as for myself. And I do encourage kids to try several times. And I generally always give them a confirmation message to let them know that their scores were recorded. So let's dive over to quizzes. I typically do make this a quiz just because I want kids to get that immediate feedback. That's generally what I use Google Forms for. I have used this lock feature before, and it does work extremely well if your school system actually has this set up properly, but I typically don't do that because I'm not using Google Forms as like a formative assessment tool, so I typically don't mind if students are navigating away from that particular tab. But I have used it and it does work really well. I usually always have it report to the students immediately, but down here these are pretty important because generally I don't allow kids to see the correct answers because they just will share it with one another, so I don't really ever allow them to see the correct answers. Point values, I do select this if I want kids to show me their scores when they've completed the Google form. So there are times where in a traditional classroom, kids will just literally show me their score on their computer, and I can type it directly in the gradebook, which is just saves me time. But more often than not, I actually don't select this because I do create questions that actually have a 0 point value. And I don't want kids to know that. Like, I'm actually not giving that like a paragraph question. I'm not really giving them a grade for that. Like, I might review it, but I don't want kids to know that it has a 0 value. So there's times where I don't select this right here at all. I typically have it just selected as missed questions, where it will show a kid. It'll just highlight it as red and let them know that they missed it. And then I do encourage them to go back and review and see how they can improve that quiz. So playing around with these features is pretty important, because you could actually manipulate with a function of your Google Forms. So these settings here, there's a lot you could do for your students by manipulating these resources here. And I just shared with you some of the things that I do. The other important detail here, let's dive into some, like a completed Google form here. So here's a Google form I recently worked on, and notice that it's requiring an email address. You could add text, you could add images. So here's where you add text, here's where you add images. I've also divided it into sections, and I'm going to show you why. So this kind of just outlines the instructions, which again, I just put that in one single section, so it's a nice little chunk for students. Here I've added text, I've added a YouTube video. It's so simple to embed YouTube videos. You know, obviously I just recommend very short ones. And then I have an infographic, which I added by using this feature here. I added text where you can insert links to other resources, and these links are live for students. When they see the Google form, they'll be able to click right on that link. And then here's something that I really wanted to show you, because this is helped me as a teacher so much. So I'll create a short little section about this particular concept, and at the end I'll ask them a reflection question. And you can set this up where, and I did this by creating a question, and this one's multiple choice. First of all, you can require kids to do it or not, which I generally require them to do it, because I'll show you why. They actually advance in this Google form depending on what they answer. So here you can see that unless they select the right answer, it re-invites them to the content that will help them get the correct answer. So this Google form is essentially set up where kids only advance through the Google form by mastering the content, which is so useful. In order to do that, you just go to section based on answer, and for the wrong answers, you actually could just divert them to different sections, and this is amazing for differentiation, just amazing. So you can get really clever at, if kids are selecting a particular answer, you can actually have them arrive at a different location in the Google form to differentiate and help them out. And if kids master the content, they obviously advance to the next section. So that's a particular strategy that I find extremely valuable with Google Forms. I'm not really using Google Forms as like a quiz per se, but it is created in a way that gives students immediate feedback and helps me differentiate my instruction. So these are some of the things that I wanted to share with you about Google Forms. And next, I just want to make sure that you guys know how to actually send it out. So in order to do that, you hit this send button up here, and you could email it, which I typically do not do. At best, I might email this to a colleague to collaborate on, but I typically use the link feature here. So this is what I actually supply students. This is what I would put into my learning management system, such as Google Classroom, or on a website as a hyperlink. And I typically do shorten it. I really don't have to, but it's essentially the same thing. And there are times where I use the embed code, so I'll actually copy this embed code and insert it onto a website, and the Google form will be embedded right onto the website. So these two right here are typically what I use, but the link is by far the most useful for me. That's what I send students, and that's what I send teachers in order to collaborate on them. So that's super important. So I hope I shared with you some interesting things that you could do with Google Forms. One last thing I needed to show you is what it actually looks like to look at some of the analytics. So in order to do that, you click on responses here, and you can get like an overall summary, which does help you determine how valid your Google form is, or whether or not your students are really understanding the content. You could differentiate your instruction in the future. It shows you student score reports and timestamps, which are all extremely useful. It shows you analytics of every individual question, which can be useful because you could actually determine maybe one of your questions wasn't really a valid enough question, or there's a particular question that students have misconceptions about that you could address. And there are times where what I would do is I'll just hit Control F and I will search for a particular student. And what I can do is, look up her grade and put it in the grade book. What else is you could actually dissect each individual question and see the particular options that kids are choosing, and also look at individual students, which I use occasionally if a kid has a very specific question. There are times where I would just have to, find that particular student. We look at their Google form individually, especially for like short response answers where maybe they type something wrong or misspelled something. But generally I'm in the summary area and I'm just searching for the kid's grade. But those are some of the interesting things that you could do with Google Forms. I hope this tutorial was useful. I hope I gave you some neat little tricks of what you could do with Google Forms. And I really appreciate you taking the time to spend here with me.